Thank you very much. Great. We're entering a world where we leave nothing to chance in our service of the selfish gene. We see the chance to grab evolution and bring it under control. We review every facet of the possible traits for our offspring from thousands of possible people to narrow down to just those traits we desire. We use our wealth and white privilege to limit the gene pool to the best and brightest, in our opinion, and we decide in a dispassionate way how and when we will create the next chapter of our particular genetic heritage. But we're not here to talk about Match.com, so let's talk about CRISPR. Whoa, hang on a minute. That's right. No, stop. Come back. Put the book down on the button. Here we go. There we go.
Go back to Match.com.
Okay. How do I get up here? Let me see. So, I've been thinking about this talk for a long time because usually I'm talking to cancer patients and cancer researchers and people that I know are really engaged with the topic. When I thought about this crowd, something made me really nervous, which is this is a really educated group of professionals who know more about the topic than I do, which means that you're the most biased group of people I've ever talked in front of. And so to lessen my anxiety, I decided to put on a meditation tape of Deepak and Oprah. And I'm going to listen to that while I do this talk. Because it'll make me feel better, and that's what this is all about. Now, you might find it a little disorienting that I have my earbuds in, but I find it a little disorienting that you have your earbuds in. Because when I say curb your elephant, Jonathan Haidt pointed out that we are just riding on an elephant that represents our subconscious brain. And we think we're guiding the elephant by riding it, when in fact the elephant goes where the elephant wants to go. And the elephant makes its desires known by putting that little voice in your head that right now is not listening to me. It's criticizing everything I'm saying. You're thinking about what is my opinion about what he's about to say. I don't know that I agree with that. Maybe I would have approached this differently. Why does he say that? If you're married, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So I'll make you a deal. I'll take my earbuds out if you take your earbuds. And by that, I want you to do me a favor. And for the next 15 minutes, if that's how much you can handle, or even 30 if you're exceptional, I want you to turn off that voice that's going to be criticizing me and just listen. Because that voice is not you. That voice is subconscious you that pushes you around in everything you do. And if you could just turn that voice off long enough to listen, and by listening, I mean, are you able at any given moment to repeat what I just said, word for word? Now, there's a therapy called imagotherapy, you may or may not be aware of, in which married couples have to sit across from each other knee to knee. And one of them gets to say how they feel about something, and the other one has to repeat it back to them word for word. Do you know how hard that is? Do you know how hard that is? Try that at home sometime. And have a third party there who can separate you. Because it is really difficult to say to your wife, I understand you feel neglected when I come home and talk about my day before I ask about your day, even though I was in the Oval Office. You can't do that. You have to just say, I understand. And then you get your chance later if the session lasts that long. Now there's something else I want you to do. Everybody with a phone, hold it up in your right hand. Everybody who's got their phone now, hold it up in your right hand. Now I want you to pass it to the person behind you. Seriously, I want you to pass it to the person behind you. And I want you...
False sense of security.
It's not that easy, is it? I want you to let them have it for the entire talk. Now, here's why. Here's why. Number one, if you think you're missing something, I am not offended if you leave and go out in the hall and wait for it. Whatever it is. And you could read Waiting for Godot, it's not many words. But here's the deal. Do you think you can trust the person behind you not to screw up your phone and read your text? And does the person in front of you trust you to do that? Because if you don't trust the person behind you with your phone, why would you trust a CRISPR scientist with your germline? Think about it. Let's just start there. If you don't trust somebody with your phone, why would you trust them with your inheritance? So, anyway, when I say curb your elephant, that's exactly what I mean. Try to listen and not be talking while I'm talking in your head, because it really bothers me. So, communication is really, really difficult. I'm from Blytheville, Arkansas, in the Delta, the grandchild of Lebanese immigrants who came over a century ago. I have nothing in common with most of you. I grew up in a farming town that used to have 20,000 Mexican immigrants come and pick cotton every fall. My father had a grocery store. That's a great thing to have in a town with 20,000 people who come every year. Then we got pesticides, and then we got cotton picking machines, and they don't buy food. So my little town went right down the toilet. And it stayed that way for a long, long time. And so my view of the world is very different than if you grew up in Berkeley, LA, Chicago, New York, Washington. So when I think about my reference points for the world, they're very different than most everybody I know, except the people I grew up with who are all Trump supporters. So how do we communicate? And the answer is not very well. Because most of the time we're talking to ourselves. Right? Most of the time we're talking to ourselves and in the presence of somebody else. So that raises the question, well, how do we communicate? Which raises the question, in my speech, why do Americans love movies so much? As you saw, we love movies so much. Well, think about what a movie is. You go with friends or on a date, and you sit in the dark, and you face the same direction, and you watch the exact same story, and you hear the exact same words, and the music is designed to make you feel the exact same thing at the exact moment, and you're communicating. This is a perfect environment for a man. You get to sit in the dark and not have to talk, and you get credit for it. Oh, wasn't that a great movie? Yes, we had a great time. And the guy's thinking, yes, and I didn't have to say anything. So the reason Americans love movies is it's how we talk to each other. It's how we talk to each other. It doesn't exist until we go see it in a movie. Right? It doesn't exist until we see it in a movie. Go see Detroit. All of a sudden the riots exist. Right? Go see Private Ryan. All of a sudden Normandy exists. Go see the movie about the women mathematicians. All of a sudden black people have a history in NASA. So we don't really know it's there until we see it in a movie, and that's how we communicate. And until we learn to communicate the way we do in movies, it's really hard to get anything across to anybody, and that is we have to put everything in the context of a story. Everything has to be in the context of a story. Because as someone said, this was a terrific panel. Nobody wants to hear facts. You don't want to hear facts from me. But everybody wants to hear a story. And if the story makes them feel a certain way, then maybe they've learned something that they weren't even thinking about learning. So let's share a story right now, because it's kind of important for us to know how we got here. So that's okay, you can clap. I stole that from Mike Milken. He did it up until 2009. I had to add the last 10 years, which is a real challenge. If I asked you, what are the most important technological breakthroughs in the last 10 years? Are you going to say Facebook? A lot of people do, right? Twitter, a lot of people do. I didn't, but that's okay. But all of these technologies had what-ifs associated with them, right? Like, what if the ENIAC fell over and killed somebody? What if computers get personal? What if the Internet of Things locks my refrigerator at 8 o'clock so I can't have that snack and get fat? I mean, all of these things had things we had to worry about, some more important than others. Like, can polio vaccines give you polio? Yes, if they're not made right. Did you know that Jonas Salk purposely did not patent the polio vaccine? Because he wanted it to have the widest possible distribution? And when I talked to him about this about a year before he died, and I asked him why, he said, because I thought that would be the best thing for humanity, and boy was I wrong. Because people who didn't manufacture it properly gave people polio. And he didn't have control over it. So you just don't know. But here's another what if. The telephone was designed to help originally deaf people, because that's what Graham Bell was working on when he accidentally discovered the phone, not hearing aids. And it disenfranchised the deaf for decades until we found a way for them to use the phone. Al Gore never said he invented the internet, but he did invent C-SPAN. He introduced the bill to have the proceedings in the Congress put on television because he thought it would be a boon to democracy if people could watch the debates in Congress. And instead, the opposite happened. Because people knew they were on TV, they started saying silly shit. And they started trying to turn into stand-up comedians and bad actors. And so when you go to watch the Senate, the world's greatest deliberative body, nobody's there. Because they're in their office watching it on television. And they're not listening to each other, which I go back to my original point. We don't listen to each other. So a lot of what-ifs around technology because you just can't know. So let's talk about Battle of the Bands. And I thought a long time about this, not just because I was a professional drummer for many years after college, because I couldn't get into graduate school, Actually, I tried to get into graduate school in an interdisciplinary PhD program, which is rather pedestrian these days, but in 1973, you couldn't find any, except at Cornell. And I was trying to be a psychohistory double PhD, philosophy of history, personality theory of psychology. And they were too interested in rats for me to get in, so I became a drummer. And so I was in a lot of Battle of the Bands. And the question becomes, what are the principles that we're going to use to decide what's in, what's out, what's allowed, what's not allowed? So one of my favorite books, and I'm sure you've either heard of it or read it, is, people say Gödel, Escher, and Bach. I speak German, and it's actually Gödel, Escher, and Bach. Gödel is a really interesting fellow. He didn't trust anybody to make his food but his wife. When she went in the hospital, he didn't eat, and he died. I'm not making this up. By the time she got back, he was dead because he wouldn't let anybody else feed him, and he didn't feed himself. Go figure. But he came up with something really important. All mathematical systems have a problem they can't solve. Every mathematical system has a problem they can't solve in that system, and you have to build another one to solve it. The perfect example. Everything I say is true. The next sentence. What I just said is a lie. How do you solve that one? Well, you can't in that context. You have to go to another system. When I was in the 7th grade, we had a special mathematics study group, an experiment by Harvard on poor white kids in Arkansas. And we had to learn imaginary numbers. And I refused for a year to believe you could have the square root of a -1. I still do. But you can. But you have to imagine it. But I didn't want to because I was very conservative then. I became the chairman of the Teenage Republicans of Arkansas. And then I had a car wreck my senior year and I became a Democrat. But here's the thing. If we're talking about limits in a limitless future, all limits arise from a system. All systems have limits. That's what Gödel said. Therefore, all limits are limited, which means that the possibilities are limitless. Go ahead, think about it. It's true. All limits are limited. So, what does that mean? How are we supposed to deal with it? Well, what are the systems from which these limits arise? Religion, ideology, ethics, technology, psychology. Now, there are probably a lot more, but they're subsets of these. Religion, no, just can't do it. You know, I've got half brothers-in-law in Omaha, Nebraska. All they cared about was that Trump was sent by God to reverse Roe v. Wade. He can embrace Nazis all day long, they don't care. As long as he gets rid of abortion, he's sent by God. I'm not making that up either. Ideology. There should be a feminist approach to genetic engineering. There should be a social justice approach to genetic engineering. There should be a global equity aspect to genetic engineering. Ethics. We should have a system based on consequences or values or duty. Some of the ethics papers I've read, those are the three things people tend to fall into. Either the action creates a good consequence, or it's based on a value, justice, equality, or it's my duty. As Kant would say, it is the imperative that I act in a certain way a priori. Regardless of the situation, there's a duty to do the right thing. And if you're married, you know how hard that is. So, technology. Well, you just can't do some things, right? CRISPR is way overhyped right now. All the off-target effects have already made case 9 obsolete. There are other enzymes coming along that are going to be much more specific, and there'll be more after that, and there'll be more after that. When's the last time you had a debate at dinner about fetal tissue research? Remember when that was everything? Remember when IVF was everything? You don't hear them anymore. And psychology, that's my favorite. So, I'll come back to psychology in a minute, but in history, we've had government monopoly. We had government monopoly on nuclear power and nuclear energy at the beginning. We had government monopoly on the internet when it was military. We had public utilities like nuclear power, and the telephone system was monopolized by law for decades. We had compulsion, which means you have to get vaccinated to go to school. We had regulatory things. You can't own the airwaves. unless you have, are you ready for this? High moral character. Where did that go? How did Fox get in there? So, and then you have societal limits. We just aren't going to do that. We just aren't going to do that. Now, that elephant you're riding, it's a very different elephant if you're Hindu. It's a very different elephant if you're Muslim. It's a very different elephant if you're Jewish. Because there are societal values that have been built into your brain through the culture you were raised in that are very different than your basic white Christian or your white agnostic Buddhist, which most people from Arkansas are not. But the trend in limits, as my friend Aaron, where are you Aaron, would know, is toward freedom. We're democratizing everything. Look at the internet, look at the social media, look at the ability of every person to be a publisher. Everybody can put their opinion out there, and when there were just 3 TV channels, we got so much more truth than we get from 500. It's just the way things work. It's more affordable now. You don't have to be rich to do genetic engineering or to do so many technologies, and you can do it yourself. So the trend in our limitless future is toward freedom, not toward more limits. So let's talk about the psychology of limits, because this is my favorite. Because I thought there are many ways I could summarize what causes things to be limited. But I think Freud, it's a good thing because a friend of mine wrote a paper on the neurological basis of Freud's theory of personality, where you can locate the id, the ego, and the superego in your brain. Right? Now, what happens? Well, the id, as we know, has certain traits of constant self-satisfaction. The ego has a little bit more self-control, but more, you'll get it in a minute. And the superego we're very familiar with, that's what people tell you can't do that. Sit down. So let's put faces on this. So, I think it's fair to say, in a bipartisan way, that Trump is id. Can we all agree on that? And that's because he can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, and he doesn't ask anybody. Nixon, on the other hand, was ego. Nixon did a lot of really good things because they thought it was in his self-interest, like the EPA and their breakthrough to China. But his ethics were, as long as no one's looking, I can get away with this. That's ego talking. Id doesn't care if anybody's looking or not. Ego does. And so Nixon was like the ethics of not getting caught. And of course, that usually leads to getting caught. And Obama was the superego. And you think about it, for 8 years, Obama let people treat him like the N-word in public, in his face, and he never once responded to it. He never once engaged in that fight. Nor did he feel sorry for himself in public, nor did he whine. He constantly took a societal approach to race relations, to health care, to foreign policy, and whether you agreed with it or didn't agree with it, it was never about him. That was superego. And this is another way of looking at it. Trump is definitely all about me all the time. Nixon was, is anybody out there? And Obama was, yes, we can. Makes for a very different social approach to limiting technology. So, AI, which as you know stands for any intelligence. This last panel brought up something really good. Did you notice how everybody was really engaged and engaging? Because they were women, primarily, except for the guy over here who's also very good, high EQ. Do you see that in the AI community, which is mainly bros writing algorithms? Are they going around with focus groups saying, do you mind if I fly a drone over your house? Do you mind if I find a plane that can fly itself so we don't have to worry about pilots anymore? Do you mind if I put a self-driving car in your city? They're not asking anybody's approval or opinion or engagement. They're doing it in a very guy way, which is, don't worry, we have an algorithm for that. Well, what is an algorithm? It's a mathematical system, which means it has a hole in it. Which means if you're relying on it to protect you from something or to not do something wrong, you're stupid. Because algorithms are only as good as the first problem they can't solve. And since they've all been primarily written by men, with no empathy and no social justice values, we should not have high expectations of it. So how do you limit AI? Well, first, be afraid. Be very afraid. Because here's what's happening. AI is taking the elephant in your brain, and he's making it bigger and putting it in the world. I don't know my mother's phone number because it's in my phone. If I lost my phone, I would not be able to call my mother. Now, how pitiful is that? But that's because I've outsourced part of my brain to technology. Well, AI is saying, let's outsource most everything to another brain that's not yours. Wow. Is that where we're going? Is that where we want to go? That we do less and less with our brain so we can do more and more with the other brain? There was a funny movie where the people my age were trying to remember something, and people who were in their 20s, and the people my age say, let's Google that, and the people in their 20s said, no, let's just not know. I thought that was great. Let's just not know. We'll figure it out later, right? I thought, this is great. This is progress. Let's just not know. It was like a time machine. It was back in 1968. Do you know? No, I don't. Do you know? No, I guess let's wait 40 years and we'll Google it. So, do you know what the company does that's starting to put chips in their employees? Have you read this story? They make vending machines for break rooms at companies. That's who's leading the charge to put chips in people. First they put chips in the break room, and then they put chips in the workers. Our language is insufficient to distinguish the two, right? So they're putting a little chip right here that lets you wave yourself into that, wax on, wax off, except the door opens. Or you get timed in and timed out. Or you log on to your computer, you wave at your computer. Well, let me ask you something. Where do you begin? Where do you begin? Do you begin at the limit of your skin? Do you begin on your Facebook page and people can offend you and make you feel violated? Do you begin on your career? Is that how you view yourself? You're out there? Don't we have a sense of self that says you can't really put something in me that's not in my control, that I can't take out unless it's like a heart pacemaker or something I want you to... So these workers said, go ahead, put it in, chip us, we don't care. Your phone tracks you far better than these little chips will. But as you know, I can make you give your phone away. I can't make you give that chip away. Now, everybody take your left hand and give it to the person behind you is not an option. So I was thinking about this, and I thought, when I went to Washington in '85, one of the very first cases I worked on was the case of John Moore. Who knows the case of John Moore? The Mo cell line. John Moore was a truck driver who had leukemia, and when they took out his huge spleen, they discovered he made an enormous amount of T cells. So they immortalized the T cell line without telling him, started a company, and they kept bringing him to LA to get more blood. And he got suspicious when they put him up at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. He thought, this is a hell of a place to put a patient. So he hired a lawyer to see what was going on. And they found a patent, the Mo cell line. And I went to the California Supreme Court. We had a hearing in my subcommittee in Congress where I was the staff director. And the issue was, does he have a piece of the profits from this company because they didn't tell him they were going to start a company? And the California Supreme Court said, you owe patients informed consent for commercial purposes, and if they give it to you, they have no say and they have no rights because they give it to you with full consent. John Moore didn't, but we're not going to award him monetary relief, but he won the argument, and everybody else had to inform people of commercial purposes. The scientist who did that, David Goldie, later committed suicide in New York many years later. I have no idea if it was related, but this was a big deal, right? This was a very big deal. But one of the things we learned during the hearing, because we spent so much time thinking about it, was what does it mean to give bodily tissue to somebody for research? And here's the example I used, which goes to the chip. You're all swallowing right now. You don't think a thing about it. It's not icky. But if I said, spit in the cup, and in a minute drink it, you would say, it's not you anymore. It's you when you got it in here. So now you're going to let people put pieces in you for work, not for health, not for any other good reason, but so you can log on to your computer by waving your hand. This is not the droid you're looking for. I mean, this is scary. And then we get to CRISPR. So, let me just say, I had no idea. Let's just start there. I personally have no idea where this is going to go or where it even should go. But let me tell you a story about why I'm interested, because when you get to be old like me, you kind of see things come around again and you go, oh no, it's coming around again. In 1985, when I moved to Washington, 3 things happened. The John Moore case, the strawberries that were being treated with something to prevent them from freezing, ice minus, and the Challenger blew up. So I had an eventful 6 months when I first moved to Washington. And in the middle of all that, my boss got fired, and I became the staff director of a subcommittee I hadn't even heard of until they hired me. So serendipity made, a difference in my life. So we were doing, on the science committee, nearly all of the hearings that were being done on genetically modified organisms in the environment. And to make a long story short, it's settled like this. Twice in my life, 30 years in government and in the industry and nonprofits, I've kicked people out of my office. Once was when Monsanto was in my office saying, bovine growth hormone is nothing to worry about. This is ridiculous that you're going to have a hearing on it. Your congressman's from Missouri. We're in Missouri. This is crazy. And I said, get out of here. Then, next week, the environmental groups came in, whom I knew and I was friends with, and they said, all of this genetically engineered food is going to be so dangerous you can't even do experiments to find out how dangerous it is. You shouldn't allow it to happen at all. I said, get out. And come back when you're ready to talk about facts. So what ended up happening? My position was, and the committee's position was, bipartisan at the time, you could actually get stuff done. Let's do controlled experiments and get some data and see what happens. Do the genes spread? Do they cause other problems? We've got all the people in the world interested in the pesticide resistance and the drought resistance and all kinds of things. Let's find out some facts. And that's what we did. And in the process, because the government was incapable of implementing a brand new regulatory law for biotechnology, we implemented something called the Coordinated Framework for the Regulation of Biotechnology in 1986. And that said, here's how the existing laws about toxic substances, pesticides, food, drugs, everything, these are how we're going to apply it to biotechnology products, and we're going to regulate, as was said a minute ago by Michael Spector, the product, not the process. What counts is the product, not the process. And that has held up now for 30 years. I was on a panel with Aaron Gentry and some other people, and the guy who makes the kit where you can turn your plants into glow plants was asked, how are you regulated? He said, without knowing me, he said, oh, there's this great report called the Coordinated Framework for Regulating Biotechnology. I went over and gave him a hug. Nobody had mentioned this in my presence for 30 years. I was so excited. So, now, fast forward to 2000, the State Department asked me to go to Europe and talk to people in the EU about how we regulate GMOs in the United States. So I did. And I went to England and France and Germany and met with the Green Party and all kinds of people. And they said the exact same thing they said in 1985. And I said, guys, women, we've had 15 years of data. There are no adverse effects anywhere. Does that matter? And they go, no. Because we have an ideology that this is wrong. And that's just all there is to it. So fine. So 2008, I'm on the FDA Transition Committee for Obama, and we have hearings about, food. And so we have a hearing on food, and my good friend Margaret from the Union of Concerned Scientists, whom I'd worked with in the mid-'80s on this topic, came to testify in front of our little transition meeting. And she gave the exact same testimony she gave in front of my subcommittee 32 years earlier, or 30 years or whatever it is. And I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I looked at her, and I smiled, and she looked at me, and she laughed, and I said, "You've got to be kidding me, right?" And she said, "No, we have the same opinion we've always had." And I said, "Even though there's not been one reported case of adverse human effect from eating GMOs, you're sitting here telling me that we should ban them from the food supply." Yes. Fine. Let me introduce you to peanuts. Let's ban those because people die every year. So that's what's going to happen now. And the reason it's going to happen now is because CRISPR, as is AI, is a mirror on society. It's not a light, it's a mirror, right? It reflects you, and if you come at this from ideology, philosophy, boosterism, profiteering, then you're going to promote that onto CRISPR, and we're going to have those same debates without getting to the critical question, which is, what is possible, what is utilitarian, and what is too far? What is safe, and if it's safe, is it effective? Because it's being regulated as a drug. And when we talk about the next generation, and the NAS report talked about it, and we say, you shouldn't do germline editing unless there's no other reasonable alternative, there is always a reasonable alternative. It's called adoption. But in our culture, we have this addiction to vertical genetic transmission. Right? It's called sex and having a kid who looks like you. Right? Now, my friend Alta Charo, who chaired that group, said, you know, I keep telling people they have horizontal genetics. They've got cousins, they've got siblings who may not have the same problem, but that's not good enough for them. They're addicted to vertical genetic transmission because our culture is that way. So there is always a reasonable alternative unless you're unreasonable. And the other reasonable alternative is that what was discussed earlier today about checking the embryos to find the ones that don't have the problem. The other reasonable alternative is if we can fix something in a current human being and a new human being is born with the same thing, let's fix it after they're born instead of playing craps with the dice of a human embryo that's going to go through enormous changes when we still don't understand how stem cells work. So we get way ahead of ourselves in the debate about should we do germline editing when we haven't even addressed the issue of what's a reasonable alternative and what is the role of adoption in our society, what should it be, which also I would point out with the artificial intelligence, what about real intelligence? Have you seen our educational system lately? How can we be spending so much money on artificial intelligence when the real intelligence is going down? When the real intelligence is going down. Two examples. Al Gore was on TV. You may have seen Anderson Cooper. And a guy from Tangier Island whom Trump said, don't worry, climate change isn't going to affect you. And this guy got up in front of Gore and he said, I live on Tangier Island and we're not seeing climate change. And Gore said, well, have you seen shoreline disappear? He said, oh yeah, we see a lot of shoreline disappearing. And Al said, well, why do you think that is? He said, well, it's not climate change, it's wave action. Now Gore kept his cool, and he said, well, let me ask you, do you think the storms have gotten worse in the recent past? Oh yeah, I've lived there my whole life, never seen anything like it. And what would happen if sea level rose 2 feet? Oh, we'd be toast when we were only 4 feet over water to begin with. But he didn't believe in climate change. But if you just told him, sure is wet there, he would have said, yep, sure is. But he just couldn't agree to climate change because he's allergic to it, right? He's allergic to it. So Obama, press interviewed 15 people from Alabama yesterday who said, well, I don't like all these neo-Nazis, but you know, it's Obama's fault. And the reporter said, really? They said, yeah, Obama set race relations in this country back 100 years. And I'm thinking, I know why they said that, but they don't. They said that because they couldn't believe a black man was president. And that means that the last 100 years they haven't been winning. But he said, no, Obama sowed all this dissension between the races. And I'm thinking, Obama probably sowed less dissension between the races of any president I've ever known. Lyndon Johnson sowed more dissension by taking such a hard stand on civil rights and voting rights. Obama, you could argue, was actually kind of wussy about a lot of that stuff. But to them, Obama was the problem that we saw in Charlottesville. Wow. So if we can't even agree about Nazis, how are we going to agree about CRISPR? Right? Which raises a point, which is good, because I'm at this part of my speech where I need to come to the point. We've a lot of talk today about how you convince people of anything head on. And the people who do Freakonomics did some Googlenomics. And they looked at Google searches around events to see what the social response was to certain events. And they found every time, and this is R-rated, so forgive me, every time Obama said something soothing about race and we need to get along and work together, searches for nigger went up, searches for Nazis went up, searches for white supremacy went up. Every time Obama tried to put oil on the water, it burst into flames. Now, my kids went to a Waldorf school, which means I know a lot of arcane stuff. And one of the arcane stuff I know is Goethe's theory of color. Now, you all know Newton's theory of color. You take white light, you put it through a prism, and it breaks into a rainbow. But that's not what the land camera was based on, or the Polaroid camera. It was based on Goethe's theory of color. What was Goethe's theory of color? His theory was you have the color wheel in your mind. Just like Kant said that you have time and space in your head from birth. Goethe said you have the color wheel in your mind and in your mind's eye, so to speak. And every time you see colors in the real world, the complementary color comes up in your mind. And it was the theory of complementary colors that led to the development of the Polaroid. So every time somebody says love, we think hate. And every time somebody, as the president did this week, says hate, we think love. And the same thing is true with CRISPR. If we say salvation, people are going to think damnation. If we say hope, they're going to think not quite. So we can't go there by assuming that people will follow our language. What they will follow is our story. Right? They'll follow our story. That heart defect that was cured was a pretty cool story, even though they buried the lead, which was that the embryo healed itself without using the gene cartridge from the CRISPR tool. It went and found the right stuff in the egg. Said, that's okay, I'll dance with what I brought. I don't need your genes, I'll use my own. So, you may or may not know the parable of Jesus fishing with the apostles. Do you know that? It's okay if you don't. My wife doesn't. She was Presbyterian too. But if you're a Republican when you were a kid, you read the Bible too. And I used to memorize the Bible. Jesus went fishing one day with the apostles and they couldn't catch anything. And in his parable, he said, cast your net on the other side and you'll catch more fish than you can ever imagine. And they did. And they did. So I was walking through Dorset, Vermont at the end of my vacation on Sunday. It's 1 block long. And there was a preacher standing outside a church being ebullient as people left the church. And there on the sermon placard outside it said, cast your net to the other side. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? What a great sermon. And then it occurred to me that I wanted to share that with you because to me, casting your net to the other side in this context, in Jesus' context, it was believe that there is more than you can see. Believe there's life after death. Don't just go with what you've always done. I'm here to give you the new message. So just trust me, cast your net on the other side than you usually do. And you're going to catch all the fish you want. So I was thinking about how this relates to the CRISPR debate. And my obsession with the fact that we subconsciously live our lives And then we consciously make excuses for why we're doing it that way. We constantly find facts to justify our prejudice and our biases. And nobody's worse at that than scientists. Nobody. But here's the trick. We have to cast our net to the other side and dive into our subconscious and ask ourselves, where is this coming from? Where is my belief in this coming from? Where is my disbelief in this coming from? Where is my frustration with people who don't get it coming from? How do I directly address that with my conscious mind and not let that elephant push me around? And it also means that when we're talking to people who have no idea what CRISPR is, we have to cast our net on the other side and be in their shoes. And imagine that you have a child with a genetic defect and someone's trying to talk to you about CRISPR who hasn't first asked you, what can I do to help you now? What do you need? Do you need a ride to a clinical trial? Do you need someone to pay for your parking when you go to the doctor? Do you need someone to watch your house when you're with your son overnight? If we don't start the story there, where they live, instead of where we live, then to them, it's a movie they don't want to see. We all have this ability. This is not something that's unique to any particular person or any particular education. It's just about empathy. It's just about empathy. So for me, when I think about the limits of a limitless future, the real limit is our ability to empathize. Because if we can empathize, then we can use this for good whenever it's possible. And if we're not sure it's possible, we can work together, not out of greater knowledge or motive to have a company, or because we can, but because we can put ourselves in someone else's life and say, this is how I can help you. Let's talk about how you want me to help you. And then we can have a real conversation. You can take your phones back now, and you can get back on your elephant. Thank you so much.
Well, all I can say is I wish I had more time with you, Greg. I know there are a lot of questions, but thank you for that engaging and provocative and certainly very stimulating talk. I have one question, and I know the audience has questions. I'd like to take more from them, but one central question that came during your presentation, and that was when you're talking about limitlessness and really sort of going against the idea of absolutes, it's almost like a philosophical dissertation in some ways. I was struck by the idea that we were talking about facts and being empirical and looking at the facts and the product rather than the process. I was struck by the fact that the genie's out of the bottle in so many ways, and particularly in the context that you were speaking. I wonder what you had to say about the idea of, we're in a world now of alternate facts, thanks to the super ego, the id of Trump and Kellyanne Conway and so forth. But what do you tell folks when they ask you just very directly about an idea like this? CRISPR, for example, can probably, at least it has the possibility of doing away with deafness. But then you have a culture of deaf people who say, we don't care. In other words, unintended consequences.
Same with autism.
Same with, exactly. So where do you draw the line in terms of what ought to be regulated? That becomes a big question when you're talking about product, even as opposed to process.
Well, I think that no therapy should be imposed on anybody for anything. If people who have deafness in their family and have joined a culture of people who know sign language and who appreciate in their mind, the benefits of being in the deaf community, say, I don't need your help, I'm surviving just fine, then I don't think we need to take it any further.
Question of freedom, then.
Question of freedom.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we don't work on it to find out, what can happen. So, as an example, I have something called Poland syndrome. Who knows what Poland syndrome is? Okay, Poland syndrome is this, right? So, my fingers were webbed when I was born. And that's because it's not genetic, it's developmental. If there's a vascular blockage of some kind, something happens. And the syndrome is your fingers don't separate, and I'm missing my right pectoral major muscle, and the muscle group that goes through my bicep. So when I was born, I had a normal hand and a webbed hand. So when I was about 5, my parents took me to have my fingers separated between my first finger and my middle finger. And then we came home and my fingers were bandaged. Now my grandfather was born in Lebanon and was very superstitious. And in Lebanese Arabic culture, you don't play with dolls. It's sacrilegious. And he blamed my hand on my mother playing with a doll where the fingers were like this, right? And he forbade them from getting the second operation to separate my next 2 fingers. So now fast forward to when I was 40, and I had no idea what I had. I just knew I could tell my left hand from my right hand, which you probably had more trouble with. And I went to a doctor and I put my hand on the table and I said, "What is this?" He said, "It's Poland syndrome." And I said, "Well, what should I do? Do I need to worry about arthritis or bursitis or function later in life?" He said, "Listen, we could fuse your joints, but then you wouldn't be able to bend your fingers at all. Is that what you want?" I said, "No." So I became a drummer, a cellist, a tennis player, a golfer, a baseball player, and I never thought twice about it. But when I was in the waiting room, I was with people whose Poland syndrome was such that they had just that much finger, and they were having to build fingers with grafts and scaffolds and bone transplants. And one father looked at me and said, "I don't know why you're here. You should count your blessings. You don't need to be here." And he was absolutely right. So
Did that inform your decision too?
well, it was part of like, why am I here? Because I had a perfectly normal life. But when I'm dealing with cancer patients, it's a different question. People go into hospice rather than bankrupt their family for one last shot. And that's a different problem.
Let me ask you about that, and then we'll go to the audience, because since you've been dealing with so many cancer patients, I'd really be keen on, and I'm sure the audience too, on knowing what you could tell us now about CRISPR and possibility of really doing something monumental about cancer.
Well, first, of course, Jennifer Doudna says, at least in interviews, I unfortunately didn't arrive in time for her talk, but in her interviews, she talks about cancer as priority number 1, along with things like sickle cell, as an area where we already are doing targeted therapies that involve out-of-the-body manipulation of T cells to train them to go fight the cancer. And cancer is such a genetic disease that it seems to be a natural idea that if this particular gene mutation is causing the problem, can we lessen the problem? I don't know if we can eliminate the problem, but can we lessen the problem? Because when you think about it, if you're born with a cancer-causing gene, you don't have cancer when you're 1 year old. You don't have cancer until something happens that makes that gene turn on or turn off to start the cancer process.
It's also, forgive me, brings in that whole ethical question about should people know at a young age that they're going to have cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever.
And I would say you can't know. Even with the BRCA gene, if there's no history in your family of breast cancer and you have the BRCA gene, it does not mean you need to go and take your breast off. If your mother has cancer and you have the BRCA gene, then your probability goes up to 75%, not 50% or 40%. So there are a lot of, and then there are diseases like mine, CLL, that's not genetic. They have no idea what stuff. It's not a familial thing. So in my case, I was expecting prostate cancer. I was expecting colon cancer, maybe skin cancer. And when they said I had leukemia, when I landed at an airport here 3 years ago, I was like, well, where did this come from? And you know how he told me? He says, your PSA is really good, but you have leukemia.
It's like all those jokes. I got the good news and the bad news.
Good news and bad news. You don't have prostate cancer, but you have leukemia.
Yeah. We'll go to the audience. Time for a couple of questions. I have some announcements to make, so if you have something, raise your hand and we will try to come to you. I mean, if nobody has any questions, yes, and the gentleman with the hand up over there.
J.D. Hansen I'm at the International Center for Technology Assessment. My boss was probably one of those guys that came to you in the science committee, but We don't have, even though Marty is a good friend of mine, we don't have such good data on plants. We do have data that the initial kinds of gene therapy have caused some defects. Through FOIA documents and other documents, uncovered about 12 times where the researchers said they thought the gene therapy they were using caused the death of the patient.
Yeah.
Those are controlled cases. These are really sick people. But we do, in these early human trials, have examples of the gene transfer not working as we thought. There's lots of different reasons for that.
I think we get the gist of the question. It's a good one.
Yeah.
Let me actually agree on that. I mean,
And so, you know, how do we,
we're talking about trials, and
as
in
we're
the interest of
dealing
time,
with
let me
this,
just
you
go.
know, how do we make sure that we don't have these, well, infants dying or other kinds of things that we know might happen?
Sure.
Gets back down to unintended consequences.
Well, yes. Well, there's a huge difference here, which is informed consent of someone who has no other options, saying that they agree to be part of the trial as an altruistic act without any guarantee or even hint that it will help them. And you know, CAR T therapy has helped many people. I've met them who have gotten out of their deathbeds. It's killed many people too. A friend of mine who has multiple myeloma was doing CAR T therapy in New York, and he was going to do the same therapy that was just approved in AML, but they found out that it was killing people with multiple myeloma and saving people with AML. So this is where the relationship between the patient and the system is critical, and it's critical in this way. We need to engage patients at the beginning of designing a trial. We need to engage patients about the endpoints of the trial, and we need to let patients do the trial where they are, instead of making them commute to some place to do a trial in the last months of their life.
But you know, of course, that epidemiologically, there are certain things that we know even at this point CRISPR can help, but at the cost of other consequences with different diseases and so forth. So you get into some really, how shall we say, almost insoluble kinds of questions unless you go through the trials and unless you do them. I'm looking at some questions up here that we have a number, and let me get to at least one of them. I think the most important ones are on top, and the height and the rank again. One of the top is, what question do you have? Yeah, no, okay, let's go below that, okay. Who gets to decide where the limits on new technologies are placed and why them, whomever them may be?
Right. So, let's go through the list of possible deciders. Congress, scary. The National Academy of Sciences, a little less scary, but they're part of the team, so to speak. General public, well, if the founding fathers didn't trust them to run the country directly, why would we trust them to run everything else directly? I'm a big believer in representative democracy, and if you need any more proof of it, just look at what's going on with the fact that we have a minority elected president, we have a minority elected Congress. More people vote for Democratic members of the House than Republicans, but they gerrymandered the majority. And we have things going on like the white supremacists, where people with a straight face say that there's moral equivalence between this mob and the people they're trying to intimidate. So I have a real problem saying that the general public should vote, because, as was pointed out earlier, they may not vote for vaccines anymore. They may not vote for evolution. They may not vote for climate change. And we have a real problem of the failure of our education system now affecting our health, our foreign policy, our society, You know, someone says, you know, that we're worried about affecting the next generation through CRISPR. So, who should decide? Number one, usually the people with the money decide. And that's often the government, but not always. People in their community or in the medical community could decide not to do something. But let's talk about Asilomar. Asilomar came up with all these rules about recombinant DNA. Did it matter at the end of the day? Did it really change anything? It's incrementalism. It's incrementalism. And as science gets better at each increment, people go, oh, okay. Now, you might think either you're the frog in the water that's gradually heating up, or you're the person who's going, hey, that's boiling water, don't go there. But unfortunately, the history of technologies, as I showed in my little slide, is incrementally they all get adopted. One last joke about that. Did you see Wonder Woman? Anybody see Wonder Woman? Anybody see it 3 times? Do you remember, and this is not a spoiler, but at the end of the movie, Ares, the god of war, has helped the Germans develop an awful chemical weapon by putting the idea in their head. And he says to Wonder Woman, it's true, I give them the idea for the weapons, but I never make them use it. They do that all on their own. And that to me was so powerful because it's so goddamn true.
That goes right back to the fear that people were expressing about CRISPR and bioterrorism. I mean, again, the genie may be out of the bottle, and we're going to deal with some of these questions as we move along, but in the spirit of the incrementalism or instrument that you just spoke of, first of all, please give a hand of appreciation for Greg Sutton.